Hello, dear viewers. We warmly welcome you to today's broadcast. Today we have a very special guest in the studio, Mr. Jozef Šolc. Mr. Šolc, welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank you for agreeing to this interview. I'm really looking forward to it and to the information you will provide us today. You are a very interesting and active person. You have a rich scientific and practical career behind you, with many professional successes, which I hope you will talk about during the interview. I would like to start by saying that you have been dedicating your life to water, studying it, and especially working with technologies related to it. I would like to follow up on that and ask, why water? Why did you choose water as the subject of your research and the development of new technologies?
I chose water somehow automatically, not even consciously. My father was a civil engineer specializing in water management, so I followed that path as well, going to Faculty of Civil Engineering for water structures, so it stuck with me automatically. And because of that, I became more interested in water when I was in that field.
And what are the most important discoveries you have made? Was there perhaps a discovery that completely changed your views on water?
I have been involved with various technologies related to water, and my thinking about water changed the most when I was dealing with transportation of large amount of water to Africa. Well, for context, every so-called invention from hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunami, breakwater lasted us a maximum of a year. But when I wanted to get water somewhere, it took me about a year and a half without being able to come to a solution. I was coming up with all possible known water management technologies as a specialist, but nothing. It was unsolvable. Billions of billions were the results. And then once I finally understood that if it doesn't work conventionally, it has to work somehow completely differently. When I was dealing with the transportation of water, I found out that it has to go through the air, and therefore it must be rain. There simply is a lack of rain. In Africa, in that 200 by 200 kilometer lake, dry, salty, basically no longer a lake, but a salt desert, once the Nile flowed there. So when I was solving this, I found out that it works, that it simply works through the air. And maybe the impacts are due to deforestation. That's a huge source of rain. The forest can simply pump water. It's actually a water pump. The forest is actually a water pump that pumps water inland, and therefore rain can just go deeper inland. It doesn't just rain once. For example, ocean moisture rains once, and then it's dry. But when there are forests, it gets evaporated back into the air, moves further, rains again, gets evaporated again, and it simply goes further inland. So, reforestation helps extremely with rain, even if one could say that it is not an artificial factor from other natural impacts. For example, the ruggedness of the terrain. This is called a mountain effect on rain. So it usually rains more in the mountains. Even near the mountains, it usually rains more. So there, I was figuring it out. Simply, how to mimic the mountains and create those gravitational waves, which significantly contribute to rain formation. That the influences, wind direction, and terrain ruggedness coincidentally met in such a way that it created such gravitational waves at a certain height. where water evaporates and condenses around and around. And the clouds sometimes stay, and they stay in place even though the wind goes further, because this is how it happens in that gravitational wave. And for stopping the rain, actually increasing the rain before it arrives is used, so not like stopping the rain. I don't know if anyone is researching this, but mostly it's done in a way that when it rains preventatively, there's nothing more to rain.
You have such an interesting hobby. I would like to ask, what motivated you to engage in this? What motivated you to start dealing with unsolvable problems? Could you tell us what kind of research you have done here?
What motivated me? Paradoxically, it was exhaustion, fatigue, and such a run in creative activity, because I had been working intensely on some projects at work for a few months. So much that I told myself I need a week off, because simply it's going to be the end. And so I stayed home for a week and immediately didn't know what to do. The TV was on, and I heard that America there was $20 billion in damages because of some hurricane. So much, I can't even convert it into crowns. But those noble Americans need to know that there has to be something to fight for the hurricanes. So I started figuring it out. And by some funny coincidence, I started this about a half year later. After a year of nonsense, I came to a more sensible solution.
So, what did you come to?
The result is that a hurricane is caused, one might say, by an uncontrollable force. And that is evaporation in the ocean and solar energy. So we can't influence it much. However, to prevent the extreme wind speeds, which are in the eye wall of a hurricane, not in the eye itself, but in the eye wall of the hurricane. It is such a narrow zone within the hurricane, it may be, I don't know, about 15 kilometers in distance, and the whole hurricane is, for example, 500 kilometers. Yes, it's such a small, relatively narrow zone where air flows upward, causing all the other tangential, the whole hurricane actually. And I calculated the components of velocity, tangential, radial, and vertical, and they are significantly smaller than the total force. The vertical component is 1,000 times smaller, and it can be calculated from average values. How much force would be needed to stop that airflow in the eye wall close to it, so to speak, like counteracting it? The result is that if a certain amount of water is pumped from the ocean at the eye wall of a hurricane, where the vertical speeds are the highest, if small droplets are pumped with seawater, of which there is plenty, it acts by its weight. The hurricane willingly or unwillingly draws in those small drops and carries them upward. So it has to do enormous work. For example, when we take the Gadjikovo hydroelectric power plant, the water falls 10 meters down and we immediately have 700 megawatts. But in the hurricane, the water is carried up. It doesn't matter if down or up, but it is carried up not 10 meters, not 100 meters, not even 1,000 meters. It can be carried up to the height of a hurricane clouds up to 15 to 20 kilometers. So that's a multiple compared to those 10 meters.
That's quite a difference.
Radical, yes. So theoretically, a relatively small amount of cubic meters per second, or 10 cubic meters per second, is enough to mitigate that hurricane speed in the eye wall. Let me add that the total energy of the hurricane doesn't change because it is caused by the sun and water evaporation. But if that energy has no way to flow where it wants, then the eye wall expands. And it's like when a figure skater pulls in his arms. He spins faster. And when he spreads them out, he spins slower. So the hurricane simply spins slower, and those extreme speeds causing the most damage are reduced.
So in this way, the strength of the hurricane would be reduced. Do I understand that correctly?
The overall strength doesn't change, but those extreme speeds are radically reduced. It is quadratic, and it goes with speed. So it goes. The strength decreases a bit, and immediately the damage caused by the hurricanes changes radically.
One more question. So actually the hurricane also takes away the heat from the ocean to space. Could it also be used in such a way to remove heat from the ocean? Because the heat accumulates there also due to nanoplastics. Could it be used to remove it?
That's all it does. All it does is remove heat from the ocean. The top layer of water evaporates, cooling the ocean water at that spot. The water humidity is taken, for example, 15 kilometers higher. That's a lot, 15 kilometers. It won't be that cold down here if the sun is reflected 15 kilometers higher. It wouldn't be so hot in the city, but it reflects on the sidewalk and then onto us. So as a result, it's hot. In cities, in terms of climate, greenery is hugely lacking. Thermal images commonly show that areas around parks are immediately cooler. The leaves are significantly cooler because the tree leaf continually evaporates, thus continually cooling itself with that evaporation. And that is also a part of climate regulation in cities and on Earth. Hurricanes are, in a way, useful for the Earth's climate because they move enormous amounts of energy from, one might say, from the Earth, where it was accumulated by the sun, and the evaporated energy from the ocean is put into that water, into that humidity. And they lift the energy into those huge clouds, and it leaves into space. So the hurricane plays a significant role. When it's very hot, when there's a lot of water vapor, the hurricane forms because it wants to prevent the Earth from extreme overheating. It transfers that energy up, and from up there, it can radiate thermal energy into space by infrared heat. The water in those clouds condenses. And additional water in the airflow condenses as well. And it heats up more. They actually transfer that heat from the surface up to 15 kilometers higher, which is very beneficial. However, this causes catastrophic consequences, such as destroying houses and similar damage. But essentially, from one perspective, they are useful, and from another perspective, they occasionally irrigate the inland areas with better moisture. Nature is accustomed to it. So the goal is neither to suppress the hurricane nor to nullify it. This technology cannot do that either, because we want to introduce those small droplets into the hurricane. So the hurricane has to exist. With a weak hurricane or a Category 1 hurricane, this would work less effectively, with less efficiency. But basically, we only want to reduce the extremes, while the efficiency remains almost in its original state, which means it lifts the heat up, allowing the heat to go into space, or it irrigates the inland. It just doesn't create such strong winds. So in this respect, it is not against nature. Because if some technologies are extremely against nature, they usually, like plastics, they influence many things. I don't know the details, but simply fighting against nature is mostly counterproductive.
Mr. Šolc, please tell us, is this a theoretical development, or have you had the opportunity to test it somewhere in practice?
Well, I definitely haven't had the opportunity to test it in practice, because a device like a ship and all other necessities would probably cost $500 million in investment. But the individual parts of the process are tested and generally known. Pumps are commonly used, sprayers are commonly used. The size of the drop and its falling speed, that's generally known. So these are all trivial, simple things. Additionally, it has been indirectly tested in several cases. Hurricanes are thoroughly monitored. Sometimes it seems to me like a house is on fire, and scientists and the whole society are just watching it burn. Scientifically examining the damages, scientifically then examining the cost of clearing, remediation. It was indirectly proven that when droplets act against the upward speed in the hurricane's eye wall, when this naturally happens by chance, there were cases where the hurricane strength decreased from Category 4 to 3, which is a significant difference. Thus, we see that nature can sometimes manage this on its own. This is proven by such partial observations or just by this fact. There has never been comprehensive testing, although scientists have been dealing with hurricane mitigation for a long time. Their goal was precisely the expansion of the hurricane's eye, but they only did it chemically and so on. And it requires an extremely large amount of chemicals. Transporting something by planes. And so after a few decades, they simply stopped researching it.
Because it is also like,
They consider it fatalism. Nothing can be done about it. It is immense.
yes, unsolvable.
So they prefer to spend billions on weapons rather than billions on mitigation.
I would like to ask about this. Let's imagine such a hurricane. We know it has enormous energy. Where does this energy go when the hurricane is mitigated? Can it cause any damage somewhere else, in some other place, perhaps in some other form?
Essentially not, because this technology only reduces the speed in the eye wall. In the narrow eye wall, the speed is extremely high. And then the other speeds are relatively lower within the entire 500-kilometer hurricane, for example. So it only changes the fact that the extreme values shift more outward, and especially that the extreme values decrease, and proportionally increase the other values, which, due to the quadratic dependence on speed, have practically no effect on the damages. A small decreased speed to a slightly increased speed has no impact. But the reduction of that large, extreme speed to a much smaller, extreme speed has a huge impact. So the energy is actually more evenly distributed, reducing those extreme speeds.
Since you use water in your proposals, it is logical to assume that water is also used in mitigating wind-inducted sea waves or protection against tsunamis. Maybe it's about creating waves counteracting the existing waves. But where to get such an enormous amount of energy to create such a mitigating wave? Could you tell us more about this technology and how it works?
This technology works on a completely different principle. It is simply a floating structure that prevents the vertical component of the wave. So each wave has some components, just like everything has some components, and simply the water passes under the floating structure. And the structure cancels out the vertical oscillations that mainly create the wave height. Yes. So it is a floating device, a massive structure, but not like some cord floats that capture oil spills or similar cord floats that capture plastic bottles today from the oceans in large quantities. But these are solid, massive structures anchored to the seabed, which have preventative functions. Thus, they reduce the wave height.
Wow, great. And how mobile should such a device be to be able to be transported or moved to a dangerous zone as quickly as possible?
Well, mobile. Considering the massiveness and so on, it's not that mobile. It takes some time for transport. Because if you want to protect an area from waves, you need to protect at least 5 to 10 kilometers of some part of a city. Regarding those structures, they're a kilometer long, but it can be transported within a few days. and it is most often used during hurricanes because sometimes three factors combine, and certainly more factors. But there are three main ones, which are the hurricane causing wind waves. Then there are tides depending on when it happens. Sometimes the tide causes half a meter rise or decline. Somewhere it is 10 meters. That's also a big difference.
Huge.
Yes. But scientists and others can perfectly monitor hurricanes today. They can determine with a 90% probability that it will come there in a week or two, and roughly where it will come. So, theoretically, it could be transported. But considering the massiveness, it might be more reasonable just to leave it there.
And do you think there is a lack of research done by scientists in this area regarding water?
I would say in every area, not just water. But there is a lack of scientific information that is comprehensive.
Maybe even interdisciplinary research is necessary, as you mentioned. We need to look at it comprehensively from different perspectives.
Yes. For example, if they found out about structured water, for instance, how water in this glass can be influenced, well, it can be influenced by mixing it a bit. The Earth has its own geomagnetic field. Even this way, the water charges with energy, if we can call it like that. When it is in nature and it rains, it has a proper movement during rain. Then it flows in a stream, then it filters somewhere, then it moves slowly in the underground. So every water is often in motion. Thus it charges. So even this, and it doesn't even have to be water movement. It can be, thus it is water movement. Even this is movement. We can mix it or do it this way because of the Earth has its geomagnetic field. If we played with it or mixed it this way for 2 hours, it would charge almost to the maximum. It has some absorption capacity, but this research is simply not done. What magnet should I use? For example, stick one magnet here, another there, stir it a bit, and those magnets have 1,000-fold effectiveness when they are close, compared to the relatively weak geomagnetic field. So there is potential for infinite research. Many studies could be done from a comprehensive perspective, and so on. For example, even the sun. Infrared radiation affects the charge. Even a person, when just moving, for example, during a slow dance, one doesn't even have to run. Cells change places in their geomagnetic field and create magnetism. The principle of magnetizing water, for example, in water treatment, we commonly used magnetic water treatments to prevent corrosion and pipeline hardness. The water is magnetized in such a way that water structures align in rows like soldiers, and as a result, it sticks less to the pipeline walls. It affects corrosion in this way. But the principle also affects many other things. Thus, the easy water. But the principle of magnetization is, for example, with a permanent magnet. So we put a strong neodymium magnet at the bottom. And when the water is still, it has no effect. The magnet doesn't give any energy to the water. The magnet is just a catalyst that creates a more intense magnetic field. And only when the water moves, then it magnetizes. Thus, it magnetizes by kinetic movement. That kinetic energy in the enhanced magnetic field. So the magnet doesn't lose energy. It exists. We just have to add energy for mixing. And thus energy is converted to magnetic energy. It's as trivial as if scientists, as if people couldn't Google it.
There is a lack of research. Like, there is much to work on and explore.
Certainly. And it would be better from such a comprehensive perspective.
Exactly. We have interdisciplinarity, comprehensiveness, several eyes, several hands, different perspectives, bring in new views, complexity. Exactly. Well, Mr. Šolc, I would like to start by saying that in recent years we have witnessed such climate changes, such climate imbalance worldwide. On one hand, there is an enormous amount of rainfall, while on the other, there are long periods without rain, and in connection with the increasing climate cataclysms in the world, you mentioned that water and water vapor, especially when absent, affect the climate many times more than greenhouse gases and are the main climate regulators. Could you explain in more detail how this regulation occurs and what role the ocean and water play in it?
Regarding greenhouse gases, the ocean and water, when I finished, I can no longer understand. For example, the water transfer to Africa. I found out that the humidity is crucial and causes a certain balance and mitigation of extremes. And simply, I knew before that there was some water in the air everywhere. But I hadn't really considered its significance. I once consulted with Professor Lepine, who was or is the greatest climatologist in Slovakia. He had this hobby from a young age. Even as a child, he studied rain, capturing and measuring how much fell. So, he really has an overview. I couldn't believe it when my calculations showed that greenhouse gases have a 6% impact on global warming. And water has 46%. That disparity seemed wrong. It's not like the ratio spoken about is 6% for greenhouse gases and 46% for water, which is a 700 to 800% difference. So I consulted with Professor Lepine, explaining that I combine the global water cycle as it exists on Earth, cleaned up the individual components, and put it all together. And it worked out. I showed him a graph and asked, "Could this be right? Is it correct?" And he said yes. So I was surprised and pleased that yes, but also surprised that the impact of water is so enormous. And in climatology or scientific work, it's all about greenhouse gases in the media, in the mainstream, everywhere. What is studied about water? And why has it happened that so much is said about greenhouse gases and disproportionately less about water? That's a disaster. And I asked him why this happened. He replied, well, when we started, and he was involved at a global level, we knew very little about greenhouse gases and much more about water. So we agreed to take water as a constant. That was probably the most tragic decision scientists made regarding global warming and the ensuing trend. So they ignored water, taking it as a constant.
What do you think should be done now? How can we help our planet return to a normal, harmonious state?
A harmonious state would be, I would say, original or natural. So we need to limit human intervention, I think. Some opponents of the greenhouse theory argue that humans have no influence at all. But I absolutely don't believe that humans have no influence. Because if in the last century or so, people have deforested half the forest area of the planet, half the forest area of the entire planet. And that has quite radical impact. And if people have significantly polluted the ocean, which is evident, when we talk about greenhouse gases, simply, scientists focus on eliminating CO2 from the atmosphere. But fortunately, nature, when there is more CO2, supports forest growth. For example, in Slovakia, if a forest is left alone for 10 years, it slowly expands. Nature has it ideally arranged, and scientists who study technology to remove CO2 face a tough challenge to make it profitable with their small ecological footprint.
What do you think? Cooperation among scientists is crucial to start addressing the problems we are currently facing. How important is it for scientists to unite and have a common goal of protecting our planet from destruction and our common home? What role does the unification of scientists play in this?
Today's system divides not only scientists but all people into automated things, I would say. Because if we take any form of division and further divide it by another factor, one factor divided by another factor divides it even more. Another factor divides it again. And by the 10th factor, it becomes so automated. So people, one is vegetarian, another is a meat eater, the third, I don't know. They are fashionably divided into what is fashionable. People, it is deliberately suggested to them to have something to discuss. So they don't focus on themselves, but on gossip and division, fighting divided into those factors against each other. So these are just people. And the more they are formatted by school, which on one hand provides useful information, but on the other hand gives little of the comprehensive information, not putting it all together as a whole. They are also deformed by the mainstream, and most people are influenced by money. So it is possible. A part of the scientists can be united by promoting, for example, to investors, something within those comprehensive matters. I assume that the question was about such research that is not commonly done, and bring it to the awareness of the people and investors. If it comes to the attention of investors, it could be financed immediately. If it were people, they could influence state research or investors simply because it is fashionable, providing funding sources. And scientists would then automatically devote part of their work to it if they could live off of it. And some might do it regardless of the current system, if they have the means for themselves, but they don't make it to the media.
And do you think that uniting scientists or getting scientists to address the problems we now face, such as climate change, do you think people play a role in that? Do you think that if people started demanding worldwide to address this climate crisis now, it could influence the cooperation of scientists?
Well, people could certainly influence it if they were in a larger community, influencing the community. For example, in their country, ensuring that through, I don't know, elections, someone who will promote that the relevant Academy of Sciences deals with these research topics gets in. They could do it this way.
Often, the media's attention goes in completely different directions, not toward the things it should be focused on.
Yes, when people's attention is focused on something, and there are many people, results can be achieved. So attention causes some change and events and so on. So focusing people's attention from money to regulation to nature, to regulate what we call a catastrophe, the climate catastrophe. But it is just regulation. Nature regulates itself. When we cut down half of the planet's trees, it tries to regulate it differently, increasing CO2 so that trees grow more or whatever. So we need to pay more attention to nature.
Mr. Šolc, I said at the beginning that you have a rich scientific and practical activity behind you. You have really achieved a lot, and I would like to ask you, which of these achievements you consider the most important and why?
They are not so much scientific. What I did was more practical at work. We did technologies, water treatment, and yes, for scientific purposes, we organized the scientific conference Drinking Water in Slovakia for about 10 to 15 years. So that wasn't scientific work, But we gathered scientists and practitioners, people, scientists, and research. And since ministers and others who attended, I personally knew all of them. So, we also showed people interesting technologies abroad. We organized excursions every year as well. So every time a person who wants to understand something comprehensively is inquisitive about it and imagines a project in their head like Einstein sometimes said, and what will happen if this and that, and so on, and goes on, and more in detail. And after a year, if something interesting is discovered, it makes the person happy.
And they want to know even more.
And they want to know even more. As I said, the initiation of those unsolvable solutions was the exhaustion and so on and the creative drive. But that was just the initiation. But when a person finally sees the result, oh, I finally discovered something, it surely works. And when it's not even yet known, it feels good. And that is also a stimulus for further activity in a similar or completely different area. But most of my work was related to water. The most beautiful, almost miraculous thing is structured water. I didn't invent much there. Just practical things, like the magnet is a catalyst, or some are very strong, and it can be easily made at home. Even when a person goes for a walk, he moves at a certain speed in his geomagnetic field. And every cellular solution in the body magnetizes during a slow walk. I have never heard this anywhere. I had to figure it out. But these are not inventions. So small, fascinating discoveries like, I discovered what I didn't know, make a person happy. So to increase one's knowledge, it can be done, but a person must first study in depth and broadly. Nowadays, artificial intelligence is an excellent tool, although it poses extreme risks that may await us in terms of manipulating people. But it can provide a lot of information and helps in such thinking. You just have to ask it carefully, because it always emphasizes that only what scientists have said and thoroughly researched is valid.
As they say, you have to verify everything, all the information. That way, no one can deceive you. Mr. Šolc, in conclusion, I would like to ask what inspires and motivates you for further research? Have you thought about what you will continue to work on, or is there something now you would like to start researching?
When any topic is researched in detail, one realizes that they actually know even less, because there are even more detailed things. And paradoxically, one sometimes feels they know even less and less over time.
I know that I know nothing.
Yes, that's right. So, there is no need to change topics. There is infinity in every topic for interesting thinking or creation. So currently, I will stay with the experiments with structured water at home, which I would say produced the energy of life. For years, I've always had some investors saying that funding for 5 projects will start in a month or 2, but it gradually fades away. Then another appears, and it also fades away. So I don't rely on that much.
This side is a bit more complicated.
Today, money rules the world and people's thinking. So this side is, I would say, the most complicated. To be able to realize and get the results into some verified, tested form, we did a lot in the company. Not basic research that is done by the Academy of Sciences and similar institutions, but more development or laboratory tests, modeling something and playing with it in the laboratory, or semi-operational, where we are not waiting but working directly in operation. Semi-operational, modeling part of the operation in a small way or even operational. I'm still talking about drinking water treatment plants, simply putting the results into operation, installing them in the operation and testing them. So I was more practically oriented. Not so much basic research, so the topic remains. I think the topics I've dealt with so far are fully sufficient.
That you have opened up possibilities and information that a person can obtain regarding water.
Mainly, it opens up the influence of structured water on water as such. It almost seems like it is really living water, not just by pH or what is long known, living or dead water. But it's not entirely like that. Living or dead water, when some effects stop acting or when something is added, the water returns to its original state. If I add baking soda to the water, it supposedly increases the energy of the structured water. But blood has a constant pH, practically constant temperature, practically constant charge. The blood regulates itself. So there are infinite options for research. We can't influence blood because it would regulate itself differently. Changing the pH doesn't bring overall energy because we don't add energy. The energy is added by the movement of the water or the movement of the body. That's why movement is healthy, not just because we build muscles like some bodybuilders, but unknowingly, we increase the energy of the water in our body when something moves. Even the leaves on trees, when there is a fruit, vegetables, plant-based food is promoted. But no one says that it also has good energy when the leaf sways. On Earth, it moves in the Earth's magnetic field. So it is maximally charged. It almost always sways, so it is magnetically charged. It is less charged when it is in a greenhouse, where there's no wind. But scientists won't research such nonsense. But it certainly works.
Great. I think these are practical tips. Mr. Šolc, I would like to thank you again sincerely for agreeing to this interview. For me personally, it was very enriching, informative, and I believe it will be the same for our viewers. And as they say, I wish you all the best. I hope to see you again sometime, and until new meetings.
Thank you very much. Likewise.